Hi, I'm Greg. Welcome to Affect Studio. I'm here to compare speakers in AC30s and share a tale about the danger of comparing speakers out of context. All the speakers I'm using are Celestion. I'm doing this comparison as I had a set of speakers in my now vintage Vox for around 18 years that I was always happy with, but sold after comparing them to others using a completely different setup. I did a general speaker comparison about 20 years ago, and based on that, decided the speakers I had been using in the Vox weren't as good as some of the others, so I replaced them with something else. Over time, I started to miss the old sound, which I would hear occasionally either on existing recordings, or more importantly as I mixed projects that had been recorded over an extended period where the amp had been used with and without the old speakers. I looked for another set, but the few I found were either too expensive or in poor condition. 6 or 7 years ago I found a set that might have been similar to the others and had been using those. I recently found a set of the first speakers in mint condition for a good price, so I decided to take a risk. I hadn't listened to them after doing this comparison. For the speakers, I have a pair of Danelectro Blues, which are the speakers most closely associated with the Vox sound, G12M25 greenbacks, which have also been used in quite a few AC30s, and what I had decided were better in my amp, G1230s, which I was told came out of an AC30. I almost didn't include them as they aren't a common speaker, and doing a search I couldn't actually find them used in any Voxes. I just discovered though they are the same model speakers that were used in the very first Vox I ever heard in person, where I realised I needed one, so I thought they should stay. G12L35s, which is the model I had in the amp for years and then replaced. Then a G12M65, G12H30 and an Danelectro Gold. 7 speaker types, 5 are still being produced. I've set this up in my usual manner with DI guitar being reamped, so the only change is which speaker we're hearing. I won't say what order they're in until later, so we aren't biased by what should be best. I've attempted to level match the clips, mainly focused on the average levels. There's a fairly large volume difference between some of them. They'll be in the same order each time. The first clip is my Rickenbacker 660-12 with a little chorus and delay. I bought my AC30 in 1987, and having been warned that you always need to carry a spare amp when using a Vox, as they are notoriously unreliable, bought a second one not long after. The second one was in rough shape, and had some dark-sounding Australian-made E-tone speakers. The first one had the stock Vox-branded Fane speakers, which I moved to the second one, installing a pair of Celestion G12L35s in this one. It was my main live amp for about 20 years, and has been used by clients on numerous recordings. My memory is that the Celestions were a little brighter than the Fanes, but not too different. For the speaker test I mentioned before, I used a Marshall head into the cab from my old Rivera combo. As a result of that comparison, I also put a different speaker in the Rivera. I took it to perform, and playing with the band thought it sounded terrible. I don't remember which speaker I used, as it was only in there for a few hours. For the next clips, I've used my 83 JV Squire Strat with EMGs, which is a guitar I used most often with this amp live. The channel's a bridge with both volumes on full. The volume on the guitar is down to about 7 for the first clip. AC30s have always been an expensive amp to build, which is one of the reasons the company has changed owners so many times. Hard to make a profit. There have been attempts to build them more cheaply over the years, with varying degrees of success. They tried full printed circuit boards for a while in the 70s and then again in the mid-80s, which didn't work so well with the huge amount of heat inside an AC30. There are 11 valves at a vintage Vox, 6 preamp, 4 output and 1 rectifier. This model was produced between 78 and 84 and is almost the same as the 60s versions. Hand-wired and laid out the same except using a solid-state rectifier. It doesn't have a choke and uses small circuit boards instead of the tag boards. In recent decades they've used printed circuit boards again, but usually reduced them to 2 channels, often removing a tremolo vibrato circuit which accounts for close to half the circuitry in the originals. Where they have included tremolo, they've used solid-state circuitry. I suspect that's a good compromise for most people. You can't get sounds like this though. This is my Danelectro through the vibrato channel on full. I'll reveal the speakers now. With this test, I was careful not to repeat my mistake of hearing the speakers in a different context, and even went as far as keeping the amp in the cab, as having it out would change the volume and dimensions of the cab. I also put the rear panels on the cab each time, just in case that changed the response. I used the amp from a second AC30, which we'll hear next, into the same cab to give more amp settings, as I only wanted to change the speakers once. The second AC30 is one I built around 20 years ago, using new old stock Vox transformers to vintage specs. The main difference between them is the second one has a valve rectifier and choke. I built one for a mate and one for me. The 2 amps are set up quite differently. They sound slightly different anyway, but I set up my original with my long-term default settings, which is plugging into the normal channel then bridging to the brilliant channel. The treble and bass controls, which only work on the brilliant channel, are on full, which sounds terrible if listening to that channel by itself. All top and bottom and no mids. I start with both volumes at the same setting and turn the brilliant volume up or down depending on what I need. The meat of the tone comes from the normal channel. For the amp I built, which we're about to hear, I used my SG into the brilliant channel by itself for a distorted clip with the volume on full, treble around 7 and bass around 4. For the clean clip, I used my Les Paul with P90s into the normal channel, which doesn't have tone controls, with a boost pedal in front so I could give it more highs. So here's a couple of clips, still through the original cab, using the amp I built. So those are the speakers. As always, using what I have on hand, pairs except for the G12M65, G12H30 and gold. The other speakers used with them, despite not being mic'd, will influence the tone slightly. So having a single speaker alongside something else won't be exactly the same as having a pair. Brian May uses a blue and a G12H30 in his AC30s. I don't know which one he mics. I believe he also uses a solid state rectifier like my original one. I know he used to use the same version in the 80s. No idea if he uses a solid state rectifier for reliability or because he prefers the tone. So what did you hear? Any preferences? It was interesting and initially disappointing to hear the G12L35s again after about 20 years. Those, the G1230s, were the least like the others, and the 35s don't have the high frequency excitement the others have. They're also significantly quieter than the others, so sounded quite weak until I level matched them, particularly alongside the blues and greenbacks, which are 4 to 5 dB louder. I understand why they seemed so unimpressive before. I think I will be putting them in my original Vox. I like the darker sound and the way they sit in a track without the hyped high frequency sizzle. If nothing else, it increases the difference between the two amps, as I have the blues in the one I built. So as always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. When you subscribe, hit the drop down menu and hit the bell so you get a notification when I make some more of these, and I'll see you next time.